This presentation will provide a brief overview of Norse research, including new insights and understandings. It will introduce recent finds that may finally shift focus of the Norse research from Newfoundland to Nova Scotia and bring us closer to Vinland. Please welcome Steve Voluckas.
Okay, that was a pretty good introduction that I was still going to start off with. One of the big debates in Norse research is that the Vinland sagas, or better known as the Icelandic sagas, are the basis for research that the Norse predated Columbus in reaching North America. And the debate has always been whether the sagas represented accurate descriptions of places and events or were just allegorical myths. And the first time I read the sagas, it was like I could recognize places I'd visited in Nova Scotia or places I'd seen when I was in the Coast Guard and we flew along the Labrador coast. And so the more I studied it, the more I realized that there are a lot of factual elements contained in the sagas. And as we go through some things this evening, I'll point out a couple of those little factual details. And pretty much the sagas had descriptions that were so vague that a lot of people thought they could describe anything from Labrador to Florida, but most people feel that most of the events in the sagas are someplace between Labrador and Cape Cod. But the only place that's been found that was documented and proven to be a Norse location is L'Anse aux Meadows up in the northern tip of Newfoundland. Now, L'Anse aux Meadows has been described by many people as being too extensive a settlement to have been founded and abandoned, that the Greenlander people who had founded it didn't have the resources to support more than one colony. It was discovered by Helge and excavated by Helge Ingstad and his wife Anne back in the 1960s. And further studies led by Brigitte Wallace and under the Parks Canada continued the studies through the 70s. And they studied the L'Anse aux Meadows, they protected it, and they built replicas up there. And it's been visited by thousands of visitors every year. Now, there's a recent study that came out last year in which they're actually able to very accurately date wood that was found at L'Anse aux Meadows to say that L'Anse aux Meadows was occupied in 1021 AD. And they could even point out the month in which the trees that the wood came from were cut down. That was how accurate the dating was. And 1021 is a little bit late, it's just towards the end of the saga periods. Now, a few years ago in 2014, there was quite a bit of interest when Sarah Parkak, who's an Egyptologist who specializes in using satellite technology to identify underground remains, and she'd been hired to investigate sites in North America looking for Norse, and she found a place in the southwest corner of Newfoundland that appeared to be a place where they were making iron, bog iron. And it was excavated in, I think, 2016, 15 and 16, and they did not find anything of interest that was not Norse related. Now, the thing when I first heard about Point Rose, is, oh, good, this brought it closer to the places I believed in. L'Anse aux Meadows was a perfect place for a staging base. From L'Anse aux Meadows, it was a direct shot to Greenland. And also from L'Anse aux Meadows, it would provide direct access to the entire Gulf of St. Lawrence without going around Newfoundland. So it was a perfect place to set up a base and to acquire the materials that they needed in Greenland and then ship them directly back to Greenland. Now, Brigitte and I have become pretty good friends over the last few years, but we do have a very friendly disagreement about whether the sagas describe one or two settlements. Brigitte pretty much maintains that there is only one settlement described in the sagas, and because L'Anse aux Meadows is the only one known, it must have been probably L'Anse aux Meadows, but it pretty much incorporated most of the greater Gulf of St. Lawrence area. And she also felt that if the Norse had settled, they probably would have settled in areas of New Brunswick area. On the other hand, when I've read the sagas, I've always interpreted as seeing that there was two different settlements. Now, in 2012, Del Muse, who's a friend of mine up in Nova Scotia, had organized a symposium near Margaree. And it's the first time I'd presented information why I thought Margaree was a prime place that the Norse would have settled. And it brought together quite a few people who had different experience, including Terry was there. But two of the people that were involved in the symposium were Mi'kmaq elders, and Merdina and Albert Marshall. And Albert asked this one question when we were preparing. So, why is there such interest in the Norse? They were here for a few years and left. Our people have been here for over 9,000 years and nobody cares. And that's a pretty good question. And I thought about it, especially before the symposium, and since I've developed revised it a little bit. But the basic thing was this represented the point where two civilizations came together. A civilization from Europe and a civilization from North America met and engaged in one of the first successful trading episodes. But the major problem was that neither side could communicate. They couldn't understand each other's language. They couldn't understand each other's culture. And neither of them would have understood the effect that dairy products would have had on the native people who were lactose intolerant. And this is one of the very accurate descriptions, I think, in the sagas, where they describe this event where the Norse traded for furs from the Mi'kmaq. They gave them dairy products, and the Mi'kmaq or the Skraelings or Mi'kmaq were very happy to take this. But then they became sick, and they thought they'd been poisoned, and they didn't want to engage in any further trading for dairy products. And then the Norse thought they were going to be hostile, so the next time they showed up, they had a few conflicts with them. And they eventually realized that they'd be threatened, under constant threat, and they pretty much gave up on the settlement attempt. But you can't help but wonder how different history would have been if that encounter had been different, if they had understood the idea of lactose intolerance. But I find the sagas have these little kernels of really important information. And it's also one of the reasons I'm glad that NEARA is spending so much time to really try to understand the indigenous cultures that existed here before the Washoshores. Now, some of you are familiar with the sagas. I'm just going to briefly go through some of the facts about them. There are 6 voyages described in the sagas in 2 different versions. The Saga of the Greenlanders, which is the earliest one of the 2 that are written, describes all 6 voyages in a very chronological order. The Saga of Eric the Red, though, which was written later, was primarily about the one voyage of Thorfinn Karlsefni and his wife Gudrid. And that was the actual attempt to establish a settlement in North America. And most people point out the fact that the 2 sagas are very contradictory, but I find them actually to be the fact that the Saga of Eric the Red is extremely detailed about the arrival of this settlement attempt, but then it intersects with the second one, and so it's like a prequel to the Saga of the Greenlanders for the same voyage. Now, there's a couple of things you need to understand about Norse navigation. One was the fact that the way they went someplace, they could measure latitude fairly accurately, but they would go to a latitude and then travel east or west until they got to their destination or to landmarks that lead them to their destination. And the other thing, there's a term called day sail. And a lot of times in the sagas, they would go someplace, sail a day and find something, or 2 days and find something. And there's always a debate whether that was a measure of time or a measure of distance. And when I was preparing the presentation back in 2011, a fellow by the name of Sivit Flodum had done prepared a paper, which was, I think, reprinted in the journal. And he determined that the day sail was 144 nautical miles. And the way he determined that was he took some of the other sagas that describe voyages between points that are still known, and he found that 144 nautical miles was considered a day sail. He also noted that they quite often, were they're following the coastline, they didn't express a distance or a day sail distance when following the coastline. And a lot of times when they were giving a direction, they would say, like, they were in relation to the wind. They sailed 2 days on a northeast wind. Now the first voyage, and this is kind of got distorted again. Anyways, the Saga, the first trip in the Saga is of Bjarni Hrolfsson, who was a Norse merchant who had tried to plan his year so he would spend every winter with his father in Iceland. So one year he'd sailed to Iceland. When he arrived, he found his father had moved to Greenland. So they got back in their ship and they decided to sail to Greenland to spend the winter with his father. And on the way, they got stuck in a really dense fog bank for many, many days with a strong north wind. When they got out of the fog, they didn't know where they were, but they kept sailing a day, and they spotted some land, and they sailed another day, 2 days, and they spotted some land. And they were basically, this is where they're using the day sails. They're sailing certain distances between finding new land, but they kept working their way north until they got to the latitude that they knew the father's farm was at. They turned east, they sailed 4 days, and they arrived right at his farm in Greenland. And the farm in Greenland was the only place with 100% certainty is where Bjarni arrived. Everybody's been fighting for years over what lands Bjarni had seen. Now the next voyage was Leif Erikson. After Bjarni had gone to Greenland, they criticized Bjarni for not having been more curious, so Leif basically followed Bjarni's voyage in reverse. And he maintained the same latitude, went westbound to Labrador and followed the coastline down, and pretty much the lands he spotted and described, the description between Bjarni and Leif were very, very similar. Then he sailed 2 days to another land that I don't believe Bjarni ever saw. This is when he arrived in what became known as Vinland, that he had sailed 2 days on a northeast wind, and he arrived on a little island, and then they saw this other land, and they sailed west around a headland, and they ran aground. And the crew was so excited to start exploring this land that they left their ship grounded, and went ashore and started to explore. And then when the tide came back in, they floated their ship, and they sailed into a river, and they first established a camp there. Then they realized they had plenty of timber and everything they needed for the winter, and they decided it was a good place to spend the winter. So they had built houses, spent the winter there, and they found grapes and timber. And then when they left, they named it Vinland. Now, when I first became interested in this years ago, I just read something about they're trying to prove Vinland was on Cape Cod, and this is the first time I read the sagas. And I thought, well, sometime I'm up in Nova Scotia, I'll look around and see if I can see anything, because I told you I could recognize places. And so in 2005, I had some vacation I had to use up, so I came up to Prince Edward Island to visit some friends. And I thought, for the last day or two, I'll just start at the north end of Cape Breton and follow the sagas the way I read them. And my only strategy was to stop in little museums in each of the towns and ask if they had any local legends about Norse or Vikings. And the first time I stopped in Cape North town, I found something a little interesting that I never have followed up on. And then the next town I stopped in was Shedicamp, which is on the west coast of Cape Breton. And their museum didn't have any information, so I went next door to this restaurant, an Acadian restaurant, and had lunch. And as I'm having lunch, this aerial photograph was on the wall. And it was like one of these things where this light bulb goes off over your head. And I realized that this photograph answered to me 2 huge questions. One of the things is that one of the reasons I think they've always discounted Nova Scotia, and especially Cape Breton, is that there's no shallow water anywhere around Cape Breton that Leif Erikson would have gone aground on. And just looking at this photograph towards the north end of the island, see the mountains, and from personal experience, I know the mountains go into very deep water right away. But just north of Camp, you can see the mountains recess inland, and there's this wide coastal plain that was not solid rock, but was probably laid down by the glaciers and would probably have been eroding over time and would have been much shallower. And the other thing was this land, this area was much more mild. The day I was here back in September 2005, when I was up in the northern part, it was cold and damp and spitting snow. And I got down to Camp area, and it's much milder and warmer, and the climate was so much better. And just the area looked like it's ideal for raising animals, whatever. So I could see this is one of the reasons the Norse would have been very happy to start exploring this area. Now, the next day I drove to Sydney to the Warren Gordon, who took these aerial photographs, and purchased the first one I showed you in this one, which is the mouth of the Margaree River. And you can see farther up in the top corner, you can see the mountains up to the north end of the island, and you can see Camp, where the wide coastal plain is, and it continues down to the mouth of the Margaree River. So I think this is the river that they came into after they had been aground. And the Margaree River is a beautiful river, just it's not very deep, but it is just this beautiful river that goes up between the hills and mountains in Cape Breton, and it's one of the top salmon fishing rivers in the world. People there, when I was there in that year, we go out every morning, and the river is just full of people trying to catch salmon. And I believe this point here was the place where Leif Erikson settled. And initially they settled on the bank of a lake, and I think originally just around the other side of this peninsula it's now a marshy area, but I think it was a lake back 1,000 years ago. And then I think they settled farther up on the top of this peninsula. Now, when I was telling you another one of the details, after we had the symposium, I can remember sitting around and we were talking about some of the details of the Norse. And some of the smallest details of the sagas all of a sudden made sense. Like somebody was pointing out the fact that when the Norse were here, and it was all tree covered like this, and they would be exploring, and Leif had told his men to explore no farther than they could return in one day. And so if they were exploring up into the hills, they would have followed a stream up and back down again. Well, just beyond this peninsula, there's a stream that goes up and it forks and goes up one top to top of a hill, and the other fork goes up farther into the little basin called Mill Valley. And there's a third fork that goes several miles to the right and back down almost to the coastline, that I've tried to find people who know that area, and they say there's nothing up there but waterfalls and beaver dams. And that's the one, I think the person went up there and found wild grapes. And I think to this day, I would almost bet that if somebody goes up there about this time of year, they would find the remains of grapes up there. Now, I'm going to go to the next voyage. After Leif Erikson returned to Greenland, he was followed by his brother, Thorvald. And he spent 2 years in Vinland. And the first year, when they got to Vinland, they sent a small boat to the west and to explore, and they found nothing but a shallow sea and minimal indication of human activity. The next season, they took their ship and went up around the north and to the east, and they broke the keel on the ship, and they spent a lot of time repairing the keel, or replacing the keel on the ship, and when they're done, they put the keel on top of this point, and they called it Carolness or Keel Point. And then after they had replaced the keel, they continued exploring, and they went into the first fjord they came to, in a place that Thorvald thought would be the perfect place for his farm. And when they came back from exploring, they found these 9 native squarelings asleep under their boats, and they captured 8 out of the 9 and killed them. And the 9th one escaped, and the next morning, surprise, surprise, they were attacked by many, many boats coming down the fjord, and who fired arrows at the Norse. And the only person who was wounded was Thorvald, who knew he was going to die, and he wished to be buried where his farm was. So after he died, his crew buried him, then they left and went back to Greenland. Now I'm going to skip ahead to there was another voyage right after that, that after Thorvald's death, his brother Thorstein came over with his wife Gudrid, trying to retrieve his body to bring it back to Greenland to give him a proper Viking burial. But they got lost. They spent the whole summer trying to find their way to Vinland, and they couldn't find it. And they ended up back in Greenland at one of the different settlements. And while they're there that winter, a horrible pandemic broke out, and a lot of the crew died horrible deaths, including Thorstein. And his widow, Gudrid, eventually went to live with his her brother-in-law, Leif Erikson. And I'll talk about that. But anyways, I'm going to skip ahead a couple of voyages to the sixth voyage, which was the final voyage that's told in the sagas. And this was Leif's sister, Freydis, who led a voyage to Vinland. And she had invited two traders, Norse traders from Norway, to come along. And but she would not let them stay in Leif's camp, or in Leif's camp, but made them stay farther from the sea and the bank of the lake. And over the course of the winter, the two crews didn't get along. And one night, Freydis went over to the brothers and said, I want to go back to Greenland. Why don't we swap boats? You've got a bigger boat. We'll fill it up with all the things we've acquired. I'll go back. Then when you fill up our boat, come back and we'll split the profits. Then she goes back and tells her husband that, these guys insulted me. You're not a man unless you go over and do something about this. And they took his 30 crew member over, and they slaughtered the 30 crew and 5 women in the other crew. But the important thing about this was that this was the one element the one voyage that really, to me, was able to identify this peninsula in the Margaret River as where the Vinland was. And this is the aerial view of that peninsula. And there's an area up here where the two triangles are, which is, I think, where the Leif's camp was located. And you can see the round area up on the top there was on the riverside, the Margaret River. But on the right-hand side was probably what was a lake. And this is where I think I found remains of another camp. And they were close enough they could have gone back and forth in the course of one night and engaged in some pretty horrible activity. But so this is one of the key elements to identifying this peninsula. Now this is another view of the river. The peninsula is there in the center. And Margaret River goes up several miles up to the right, goes up to a huge Lake Ainslie, and it also drains mainly the interior part of Cape Breton. But then it comes down this area, and I think this area here was drained and changed when the Acadians occupied this area. They were great at draining land and using it for farming. And this has a ridge. You can see a ridge almost around this area. And in the 1800s, there was a flood that broke through and made a second channel near the peninsula that exists today. Now, when I was here in 2005, I went up, it was a Sunday morning, and went up to this field on this peninsula and I noticed these mounds that were near this cabin. And I actually put my camcorder down on top of the mound to mark it and took this picture of the cabin. But I figured, okay, this is modern building. It must be, a lot of activity here, so it's not that important. But I just took this photograph anyways. And I never got back to this same place until 2012 when we were there for the symposium. And the next year I returned and was able to mark these mounds, and there's several other features around this building. And you can see how this is the outline of those mounds. And they're about 2 meters thick. The green is the center line of the mound. The orange flags are on the interior of it, and the red flags are on the outside of it. And you can see it's about 2 meter thick walls. And you also see another cluster of flags up in the middle. And I was able to find what appeared to be an outline of a hearth or something in the middle. And there's several other features around, and I think some of the original structures were also up in these trees and just to the left of that building that was there. Now we're going back to the the voyage of Karlsefni and Gudrid. Now, after Gudrid was widowed, this Norse trader showed up in Greenland, and he was so struck by her beauty that he asked Leif for him to be able to marry his sister-in-law, who was a widow. And they were married, and then they started planning a voyage to North America or to Vinland and establish a settlement. And the version of the sagas in the Greenlanders, it basically says they arrived at Vinland without problem. Their son was born. They had some trading encounters with the native people. The Norse, Gudrid, met another woman who was a native or indigenous person by the name of Gudrid also. And then they had the conflicts, and they figured it was unsafe to remain there any longer, and they returned to Greenland, and they eventually settled permanently in Iceland. Now, the same voyage told in the Greenlanders, it's Eric the Red version, is totally different. And in that case, it talks about them arriving in, coming by this point that had this keel on it, and they came by this long beach, and they followed it down. They stopped at an island that had a huge population of birds where they couldn't even walk without stepping on eggs, but it had very strong currents, and there was this fjord that had very strong currents. And the first winter, they had a really rough time. They hadn't brought enough food, and they almost starved. The next spring, they moved further into the fjord and established a settlement. They stayed another 2 or 3 years there. And then after they had established this new settlement, Thorvald Karlsefni decided to leave and explore to the west. And he went to what's called Hop, and he came back. And at the same time he left, another fellow by the name of another ship, the Saga, Eric the Red talks about 3 ships, that they brought 3 ships, 140 people. And one of the ships was owned by a fellow by the name of Thorvald. And the same day that Thorfinn was leaving, going to Hop, or to explore to the west, Thorvald was wanted to explore to the north, and he went seeking Vinland. So that meant they weren't in Vinland. Their settlement in Stromfjord was not at Vinland. He went seeking Vinland. And the saga describes him going up past the keel point and to the west. Then he runs into a storm and is forced to ground, is shipwrecked basically, forced to ground, and he is captured and enslaved and beaten and eventually dies. It wasn't, now the one weird thing is it says that he was shipwrecked in Ireland, but I don't think he made it back all the way back to Ireland, but I think there's a possibility he was shipwrecked on the west coast of Cape Breton. Anyways, when when Thorfinn, returned from Hop, he went searching to find out what happened to Thorvald. And they went up past the keel point, and they went into this river that flowed from the east, and they settled on the south bank of this river. And they eventually had the same events that took place in the Greenlanders. So this is where I think the 2 sagas intersect. The saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders intersect at this point where in this event. Now the Strait of Kanzo, I don't know if everybody's familiar with it, but it used to have very strong currents going through it. And one of the reasons they built a causeway across it was because they used to have, they have coal mines near Sydney in Cape Breton, and they used to have trains with coal that had to take ferries across to the mainland. And in the wintertime, the ice would come down through the Strait of Kanzo, and that's one of the reasons they spent a huge amount of effort to basically knock down huge mountains and fill in this very, very deep channel and build a causeway connecting to Cape Breton. But anyways, I think the main settlement, the Stromfjord settlement, is in an area called the Intervale, or Milford Haven Intervale, which is the part of the Guysborough Harbor. One of the people at the symposium we had suggested that marsh grass would be one of the key elements to find the evidence of the Norse. because when Leif Erikson arrived in Vinland, one of the things he mentioned was this grass that barely withered over winter. And also Carl Sefni had animals along that they needed feed for. So they would have been looking for places with marsh grass. And you can see the similarities of the view of Milford Haven on the top and Margaret River on the bottom. They have very similar areas of marsh. And one of the interesting things that I visited when I was up there in 2014, a friend of mine took me down to this area trying to figure out where the Norse might have settled. And one thing he pointed out was this mound that was down in this marshy area. And I took some pictures of it and didn't think anything of it. He explained he thought it was in the wintertime, the ice had just pushed gravel up into this mound. And he's talked to other people, and they've had varying theories that they built mounds of extra gravel up there for some reason to unblock the river. But a few years ago, when I was visiting some people, it all of a sudden struck me that this is a diagram that this fellow Mark Haynes had drawn about it, and you look at the size and shape of it, and you kind of wonder if it couldn't have been a Norse burial site, a ship burial. It's about 85 feet long and about 35 feet wide. And you figure if Gudrun was in Stromfjord, the settlement, while Thorfinn was off to the west and Thorvald was up to the north, and she probably had people along who would have known where Thorvald's grave was, which I think was only about 25 to 35 miles away. And I think they may have gone over, retrieved his body, brought him back to Stromfjord, and gave him a proper Viking burial. So I've always thought this mound is a very interesting thing. If I had time and money, and it's one of the places I'd really love to investigate. But anyways, the thing that's kind of really exciting lately, I've kind of gone about as far as I could go with it, and I was in the process of turning over a lot of my information to Greg Lott from Mass Archaeological Society, who was kind of interested in continuing to investigate up here. He's more dedicated to Norse research than I am. But anyways, I had the two settlements that I've kind of identified, the one in Margerie and the other Stromfjord. And in August, this fellow found these things, I'm saying just south of Port Hood, on the southwest part of the island. And this guy, Sean Hersey, was out metal detecting. And he started finding a lot of interesting things. And one of the first things he found were these Norse or silver ingots. And he actually had one of them tested by a local jeweler, and they tested and said, gee, it's almost pure silver. And it was quite interesting because it's one of the key commodities that the Norse had, the traders had, is they would trade silver for animals. I think I saw an article that just came out the other day. It talked about this hoard of silver that was found. It was only like 42 grams, and he said that would be enough to buy 0.6 of a cow. And the more he kept looking, he contacted the Nova Scotia archaeologists, and they said, well, keep looking, just keep us advised. And the more he kept looking, the more he kept finding odd things. He doesn't think these rings are necessarily Norse, but all these metal objects that are kind of melted or fused together, he kept finding. He found this stone, this odd-shaped stone, which if anybody has any ideas what that might look like to you, it's just throw it out there. He found this one kind of brass color item or bronze color item that was kind of interesting. Originally he thought it was a pommel from a dagger or something like that. But then he found a second one about 3 miles away that was even bigger, so we were pretty sure it's probably just a part of a soldering tip from a soldering iron. Now he's gone back, this area took a direct hit by the hurricane a few months ago, Hurricane Fiona. And he went out a few weeks ago. He got permission from the archaeologists to go out and take a look, but not to dig anything anymore. And he still found about over 30 targets within the area he had found most of the other items. Most of the other items he had found were in a 20 by 35 foot rectangle, and the east is facing the shoreline, so the shoreline is towards the bottom here. And he kind of identified on his metal detector that probable Norse ferrous items, like iron items, would be like 1 through 40, and then 40 to 60 is like pop tops and aluminum foil and things like that. But the silver items he had found before all showed up in the 60 to 80 range. And he said if you found a large thing like a horseshoe or the ferrous item, it would show up at like over 70. And the copper and bronze, like that solder tip, show up in the higher range. So you can still see this area, how many targets there are. And there are almost no other targets in the whole beach when he was researching it. But to me, the most important thing about this, his finds, is the silver. Because these silver ingots, if they were Norse, and if they were proven to be Norse, that also is one of the things that can prove now that the Norse had arrived in Cape Breton. And the Norse, the silver, would have normally been only with traders. Leif Erikson and his brothers and sisters were primarily farmers and settlers. They weren't necessarily trading, expecting to trade. But of the voyages, there's only 3 of the voyages involved people who were traders. Bjarni, who probably never made it here. Thorfinn was a trader, and the other ship owner, Thorvald Gamleson, was also a trader. And the 2 brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, who got murdered by Freydis, were merchants or traders. So any of those would have had silver along. And we had in that saga the potential of somebody having been shipwrecked on the shore, which could be the remains of Thorvald, maybe what we're looking at there in the coast. Now, back when I first started research in this, I think it's like 2006 or so, I'd kind of identified like 8 or 9 places in eastern Nova Scotia and Cape Breton that seemed to be Saga related. And one point was at the western end. So in order to show it on a reasonable map, in Photoshop, we took a map of Nova Scotia and made Cape Breton much larger and kind of rotated it a little bit just so it would fit on a piece of paper. And I was able to plot out where all these places potentially were. And when we got done, somebody said, "Doesn't that look like the Vinland map?" He put it together and said, it sure does, has a certain similarity. This is pure accident. It wasn't planned. And we did an overlay, and you see how closely the mainland of Nova Scotia is, the curvature and the rounded western coast of mainland Nova Scotia, and how Cape Breton, the Bredor Lake, matches the image on the Vinland map. So in some ways, the Vinland map shows that Vinland is Nova Scotia is Vinland. So welcome to Vinland.
Thank you for your presentation. You had mentioned wild grapes possibly growing in the Chenabukto Bay area. Did I understand that correctly?
No, near Marguerite, the Marguerite River.
Marguerite River. Have you been able, in your contacts with Brigida, or indeed with Canadian biologists, or even archaeobotanists, to come up with examples of either 1,000-year-old grape pollen, phytoliths,
No.
or modern populations where you still have something that could be classified as a wild grape that's still...
There's a lot of wild grapes, a lot of grapes growing in that area even. I had contacted back when I first started Brigida, and she didn't think there would be any grapes found in this area. I'm trying to remember the number. I think in some of the Nova Scotia books, but it describes how wild grapes would grow to, I think, a maximum of 47 degrees north was the maximum latitude that grapes would grow naturally or natively. And like the Margaret River is like at 46 and change or something like that. It's like right on the edge of the margin, and but it's still close to, within the possibility. Now, when I was up there, a couple of years ago, we visited somebody up in the interior, and she'd been out hiking a few weeks before and had seen wild grapes in the woods, but she didn't exactly remember where. And that's only about 3 miles away from where I'm suspecting they would be. And I've tried to get people who've spent time hunting, fishing in this, especially this one really wild river or area. And so far, I haven't found anybody who's willing or spent time up there that's noticed grapes, but they probably weren't looking for grapes.
Anybody else? Yes, Ann.
Comment, over this period of time, our climate has fluctuated wildly. We've had long periods of cooler weather, but also long periods of warmer weather. I no longer can remember if that period of time was a warmer period, and if there really clearly could have been grapes growing in a different climate scenario.
Yeah, somebody had suggested that possibly like the passenger doves or whatever that could have dropped grape seeds in their remains, but and I think the climate back 1,000 years ago was fairly warm, almost like it is right now, and so the possibility of grapes growing wild definitely exists. And I say I've tried. I've called everybody I could think of. There's somebody who's written a lot of articles complaining about a lot of clear cutting, and they do a lot of pulp harvesting up in the hills there. And that one valley is so steep they can only clear cut on the very top of it, so they really haven't clear cut into the valley. And I've talked to him once on the phone, and he didn't remember seeing any grapes up there, but he hadn't spent a lot of time looking for, he was primarily interested in the clear cutting effects.
All right, great. Thanks, Steve.